Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Rick West, the 2006-2007 occupant of the Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics. Rick West is a lawyer, an activist, a fundraiser, a lobbyist, and an arts advocate, as well as the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian. He is a citizen of the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes of Oklahoma. He is a peace chief of the Southern Cheyenne. He has spent much of his life working with American Indians on cultural, educational, legal, and government issues. He earned his BA from the University of Redlands, a master's in history from Harvard, and he has a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from the Stanford University School of Law. While here, he has taught a law school class on Native American cultural rights and intellectual property, and it's great that you're here.
Thank you very much.
And especially, I understand this is just about your last
yes,
your last stand in as it were, in Eugene. So we're very, very happy to have you.
Thank you. Yes, this interview is the valedictory for my time at the University of Oregon.
Yeah. Let's begin by talking about the National Museum of the American Indian. Let me just ask you: could you have imagined when you were a young man, that you would have been director of this museum?
Probably not, but I don't think it's quite as shocking to me that this is where I ended up, as it might seem, given that I kind of began life as a lawyer. The fact was that my dad was an artist, who's the Cheyenne side of my family. My mother was non-native. But my dad was an artist, a painter and a sculptor, and so I grew up around museums all of my life because they were Dad's chief venue in Oklahoma when I was growing up. And then even when I went on to my legal career, my work as a practicing lawyer, I ended up still having a life, if you will, or a foot in the arts and culture community, and, for example, served on the Board of Regents of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that kind of thing. So the crossover isn't quite as crazy as it seems when you first start talking about a lawyer who became a museum director.
Well, you were recruited for this position, isn't that
well,
correct?
Yes, along with others, I want to emphasize. It wasn't just I who was recruited for it.
But you were recruited. Now, I was wondering, if someone's going to be recruited for a position like this, I guess the people who recruit you have a vision, and then they bring in someone who's also going to have a vision, or they would have brought them in. I was wondering, what about those two visions, and what has been your vision of this museum?
Well, I'm not sure that when they were actually looking for the director, they necessarily had it thought through that carefully. The fact is that in the short list of the people who were considered for the position, there were 4 of us. They were all native, which I think made perfect sense for being the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, at least in this period in American history. But they had a choice between 2 of us who were anthropologists and 2 of us who weren't, and I being a lawyer, and there was another lawyer actually in the final 4. And so they certainly still had latitude in that regard of picking somebody who was probably more conventionally linked to museum work than I might have been. But I will say that there was a vision that sat behind the establishment of the museum. It was always looked at in a rather different way by the Congress, which authorized the legislation, and even by the Secretary of the Smithsonian, a very distinguished anthropologist named Robert McCormick Adams. And the Secretary, of course, is the head of the institution. They, in some respects, wanted to break the box a little bit, I think. They didn't want the National Museum of the American Indian to turn out to be just another museum in the distinguished collection of Smithsonian museums.
And tell me what that vision was, what the idea was.
Well, I think it was in probably simplified form, maybe too simplified, but just to give you an idea, I think Congress and the Secretary of the Smithsonian always looked at the National Museum of the American Indian as an institution of living cultures. In other words, they didn't want simply for it to be a presentation of collections. in the museum, even though we have a dazzling collection, probably the most important collection in the world, really, of Native cultural patrimony. But it was to be a place, I think, that opened up the windows and gave a little bit more intellectual and psychic space within the museum for things to happen in a slightly different way. So it was an institution of living cultures. It was an institution in which I think the Secretary of the Smithsonian, as well as the Congress, wanted the rather full participation, if you will, of Native peoples themselves in the formation and the development of this institution.
And tell me what you brought to it, in particular. What?
Oh, I hate talking about myself,
Well,
but
you know.
I'm just kidding. I'll tell you what I think they had in mind. Let me not say what I think I brought to it, but at least what I think they thought they were getting. First of all, they wanted somebody directly out of the Native community and with genuine ties through time to the community. I grew up as a Cheyenne in Oklahoma, where my father was born and where the 19th century reservation of the Cheyenne was located. And so they wanted somebody who had those kinds of ties. They wanted somebody, I think, who was connected with the arts and culture community, knowledgeable about it, but not necessarily out of only a museum background. This is my hunch. I mean, I'm inferring here. The last thing that they wanted was somebody who was knew his way or her way around Washington, D.C. I happen to have spent much of my legal career in Washington, D.C., and at that time, I was always in the law firm where I was a registered lobbyist on behalf of Native organizations and tribes. And so that was also a piece of the puzzle, because we were going to have to raise millions of dollars in hundreds of millions of dollars in congressional appropriations, which we have. In addition, we were going to have to raise significant amounts of private resources. And so I think they were looking for somebody who would be presentable or comfortable doing this kind of thing. It's not easy to ask for money necessarily, and so they wanted somebody who could do that. So those were the principal components, I think, of how they were framing the picture, if you will.
And how long have you been there at the museum?
Oh, a long time.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Since 1990. I've been there 17 years, and that is way longer than most people are directors of museums at this point. I think we're a little bit like university presidents. It's about 5 to 7 years.
See.
Although yours has broken that record too, actually. But most museum directors at the Smithsonian do not stay that length of time.
So how do you explain this phenomenon? You must be enjoying it still.
I enjoyed immensely. I really do. It's very much a labor of love. This is not some kind of dry, professional, purely intellectual engagement. This is something that feeds the fire in my belly as far as doing something that relates rather directly to Native people. And so that has been a lot of it. I have a passion for this job. I truly do. It was the opportunity to create and help create with others a brand new institution. Not one that I was kind of assuming control of, that might be changed or might not be changed, but this one was basically created from the beginning. And not many of us have that opportunity to sort of begin at the beginning, if you will, of the creation of an institution of this magnitude. And for that, I feel very grateful. It's been a very blessed journey as far as I'm concerned, from my own personal standpoint.
Could you give our audience a sense of where the museum is?
You mean physically?
Physically.
Yes,
physically.
Absolutely, yes. It has 3 different locations. One in New York, which is the George Gustav High Center of the National Museum of the American Indian. It is a satellite facility, but a very wonderful one. In downtown New York City. For those of your viewers familiar with New York City geography, it's right down at the foot of Manhattan, directly across from Battery Park. If you get much further south than that, you're underwater. The other 2 buildings are located in Washington, D.C. One is the Cultural Resources Center, and that is located just outside of Washington, D.C., literally in Maryland, actually, but as the crow flies, only about 8 miles or so from the National Mall. That's the home of our collections, some 800,000 objects. Then finally there is the museum on the National Mall, and that's where we, by a stroke of luck, but with great equity as far as I'm concerned, sit in one of the two keystone spots on the National Mall. In other words, right at the head of the National Mall. I can eyeball the Capitol directly from the director's office, and keep up those linkages with that body that has so much to do with us, both as the museum and as Native peoples. And we sit right across from the National Gallery of Art, and there's poetry in that, in my own mind. It's sort of a conversation, if you will, between those who came and those who are already here. The National Museum of the American Indian being our national cultural icon in a way, and the National Gallery, if you will, representing the apex or the apotheosis of non-Native or Euro-American cultural and art achievement.
And so you were saying that most of the collection is in the
Cultural Resources Center.
Cultural Resources
Center.
Center.
In Supla,
and so
Maryland.
on the mall, what do you?
Well, we put much of our collections as we can. There are thousands of objects on the National Mall, but we do not have the space on the mall to house a collection of this magnitude. It just would never happen. And that's true with most Smithsonian museums. None of them has their entire collection on the its entire collection on the National Mall. All of us have off-site facilities to house collections.
And does the more or less the permanent collection or the collection on display on the mall change quite a bit?
It does. It does. There are 4 galleries of the museum. And one of them is a changing gallery, and that turns over every year or so. The other 3 are permanent galleries, but even within those there is rotation of collections, in that we bring in the collections relating to different communities there, and so that does change. But one thing I would like to drop as important footnote to the question you're asking is that the National Museum of the American Indian isn't just about exhibitions. It's about a full range of programs that actually encompasses the entire experience culturally of Native peoples through time, right up to the present and into the future. And in that way, it again is slightly different and slightly broader than simply a palace of collections for the presentation only of exhibitions. I know that's the most important medium for museums historically, but our Expressive Culture series, for example, which is not collections, it's about people and performing arts and what Native people are doing this very day as a contemporary people in perpetuating art and culture. That's just as important to us.
In the context of museums, people talk about the fact that they need to be decolonized, I guess is the word. You want to talk about that in relationship to your own?
Well, I can begin at the beginning with that question, which is to say that Native peoples, in some respects, need to decolonize themselves or have the benefit of decolonization. There is a respect in which, for so long, Native peoples were colonized culturally. Now, what I mean by that is that their culture was subjugated. Their culture was to be put to the side, and Native peoples, in a respect, were to be deculturalized and assimilated into the rest of the non-Native population. Always a failure. Never worked. They've tried it several times in the last 150 to 200 years. Never pans out. And the reason is that Native peoples are fundamentally different from a cultural standpoint, cosmological standpoint, from Euro-American culture, and we have just never wished to relinquish that completely. And so, but given the experience, my dad, for example, went to Indian boarding schools for 20 years, where the explicit purpose was colonization and deculturalization of Native culture. It didn't work, thankfully, and I'm here to tell you about the National Museum of the American Indian probably because it didn't work. But it is nevertheless a mindset, the imposition of a kind of thinking on Native peoples themselves that we need to get out of our minds and out of our experience. So we need to go through that process ourselves sometime. But to look at it in the context of the museum, the National Museum of the American Indian is very much about trying to project the first-person voice of Native people in interpreting and representing ourselves culturally and artistically. And for the most part, we have been represented in the third person by other disciplines or other systems of knowledge that are not our own. Now, I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that. I learned much as a museum director from the disciplines of art history, anthropology, archaeology, history. But what I am saying is that even when we're using other disciplines, we need to decolonize them. For a long time, not now, we're blessedly by that period. Anthropology, for example, was about the cultural colonization of Indian people, if you will. It was the we describing the other, rather than somebody who belonged with them in the family of humanity. That's a colonial mentality, and that's what I mean by cultural colonialization. The museum is about trying to break that down, and we break it down in part by making sure that at the National Museum of the American Indian, in addition to those wonderful other interpretive disciplines that may sit at the table in other museums, we put Native peoples and their voice in talking themselves about their historical and contemporary cultural experience.
Well, how do you think we are doing as a country in moving in this new direction? What's your sense at the moment?
Better. I won't say best. We're in what I would call the comparative status, not the superlative status. But I think we are doing better. I don't know that you would see, or that I would be sitting here talking to you about the National Museum of the American Indian if this conversation had been conducted 20 years ago. Not just because the NMAI would not have yet been built, but because the National Museum of the American Indian as a concept that Congress was willing to stand behind, that the American people would be interested in, it wasn't really in the books then yet, I don't think. And that is a respect in which we're doing better. I'm 63 years old. I think back to what it was like growing up Indian in Oklahoma, which was a relative benign place to be Indian. There are other states where it's much more problematical. But even in Oklahoma, the difference between attitudes of Native peoples and communities about themselves is almost a 180-degree turn. Now, that's not to say that we don't have very real social problems on Indian reservations that are in large part the result of some of the very issues that we talked about when we were talking about colonization and deculturalization. But it is to say, and of course my graduate degree was in American history, so I tend to believe that history is for the most part incremental, but the increments are adding up. And it's getting better, as far as I'm concerned, from a cultural standpoint, than worse.
Tell me, if you don't mind going back to your father, what kind of art did he do?
Dad was he began life as a traditional plains painter, which was flat two-dimensional art, and it came from hide painting traditions, among plains Indians. And the way he ended up there is kind of interesting and sort of a commentary on evolving Indian policy. As I mentioned earlier, my father went to Indian boarding schools for 20 years, or the better part of 20 years. And there, the thesis of the day was that Native peoples really should be put in vocational schools, that college was just kind of beyond the pale. I mean, it was not something of which they were inherently capable. So Dad, to his dying day, which was late in life, he lived a very robust and ripe 83 years, was an excellent carpenter and bricklayer, because that's what he had been trained to do at Haskell Institute when he was in that Indian boarding school. But my dad loved to paint, and he had a tremendous facility for the creation of art, visual art. And he had the great good fortune, being in Oklahoma, of being there at a time when a very distinguished art historian and art instructor at the University of Oklahoma was desperately afraid that the plains tradition of painting was going to die out completely because there simply were no more artists left. And so my dad, as one of immense talent, if unschooled at the time, was brought in, along with others from other plains tribes, to be trained as a studio artist, which he was, both as a painter and as a sculptor. And from that beginning point, his art evolved. Good art never stands still. My father was immensely interested in the interface between classic or traditional plains painting and Euro-American contemporary art and modern art. And Dad went through his Cubist phase. He painted in non-representational terms much of his life. That's his work that I like best. So his art was so closely connected with his cultural genesis, if you will, and it continued to be a form, which I think is the most important thing about it, that was an expression of his cultural movement, not just his artistic development, but his cultural movement through time. It was a connecting device between him and how he saw the evolution of native fine art.
Well, let me ask you, you say that you like best the non-representational
I did.
art.
Just a
And
personal
not necessarily the Cubist phase, but the
No, he did lots of
and tell me about that. Is there a tradition of non-representational art in native painting?
You bet there is.
And so what particularly appeals to you about those paintings?
Part of it's just a personal taste.
Yeah.
I'm attracted to non-representational art because in the grand train of art history, even amongst native peoples, some native peoples, it's what kind of breaks out of the box and comes up against barriers and goes through them, as contemporary Euro-American art has too. But it did with that also. Now, I want to be very clear that native peoples were quite capable of abstraction in art. If you've ever looked at Cheyenne beadwork on a moccasin, it's geometric symbols, and it is very much non-representational in that sense. It reminds me of a little story when we were designing the National Museum of the American Indian, and a very distinguished chairman of the D.C. Fine Arts Commission said, "Now, Rick, remember, no concrete teepees on the National Mall." And he was saying it partly in jest, in fairness to him, but my response was, you know, you'll be happy to know that native peoples were among the first capable of abstraction in their art, so don't worry. No concrete teepees, but something which clearly in an abstract way will refer to us, which it did. Dad had the same feeling about his own art. I had the same feeling about art. I wanted to continue to move. Great art is always on the move, always engaging, always having an interface with other artistic traditions that will have an impact upon it.
So your father was in boarding schools for 20 years of his life. Was he bitter? Was he bitter about that experience?
No, I will say that he was not bitter, not in any way which continued and had impact upon us. I will say that he made very sure that my brother and I never set foot in an Indian boarding school. That much is true. And it was something which he would never, ever talk about. I never could get him to talk about it. So I know that it was an acutely painful thing to him. But did he rise above it? Did he go beyond it? You bet he did. And I remember his talking to me one time in the context of a particular event that was going on. I can't even remember what it was among Native people, important political event that had national dimension. And his saying that, you know, you just can't be angry and bitter all your life. It will poison you eventually, just as others have attempted to poison you by imposing upon you that which creates bitterness or anger. You have to grow beyond it. It can be a motivator to do certain other things that are constructive and of a positive nature. Not forgetting the history that happened, that's nonsense too, but transforming it into something that's much more positive. And it reminds me of that famous saying of the Mohawk, the Iroquois, I think, that basically says you can never see the future through tears. Well, I don't think Indians have ever believed they could see the future through tears, and that's why we always move beyond that in whatever we're doing, and beyond bitterness and beyond anger.
Well, it strikes me in our world today, when there's so much rancor and bitterness about past wrongs, whether this couldn't be somehow a model for going beyond conflict.
Yeah, I would hope so. You know, it's not that you can ignore that which created the conflict to begin with. You don't. You have to be truthful about that. But it is the case that you cannot continue to be polarized forever over things like that. There has to be some kind of ultimate reconciliation. And without at all discussing contemporary international politics, which is not our subject this afternoon, I will say that in the big picture of things, there is something to be learned from that. Indians, I remember Dad also telling me at one point, he said, whatever you hear, don't you ever let me hear you say that you think you're a victim of something. You're not a victim of something. Things may have happened, but victimization is actually something you put in your own mind. And it will stop you if you put it there. You need to go beyond that conception, get it out of your psyche and out of your soul, if you will, and then you will be capable of living like asistas, which is the Cheyenne word for us. That's what we call ourselves, and it simply means human being. That's what it takes to live as a human being.
We don't have much time, but I'm curious about the subject. Is it in part, when you have been in this position of being oppressed, that you have some, or you try to have some understanding of the intent, that the intent was, it was a misunderstanding rather than an attempt at genocide, or is that part of it? Is that part of the reconciliation of it, or I know
No,
that that's a rather hot subject. I mean, if somebody's really trying to wipe you out and kill you, it's difficult to get to that place of let's go past it and not.
I understand. You don't go past it completely. I mean, the fact is that genocide is not an inappropriate noun, even though people dance around about it sometimes to describe the historical experience of Native people. But it is to say that if you are a living culture and you continue to live, you believe in a future, you somehow have to, again, not try to forget that that happened. It did happen, and it had great impact upon us. But you have to live beyond it in a certain sense, and that's what's really important.
Well, I feel we could be speaking for much longer. You on that very hopeful note, I'd like to conclude and thank you very much for being with us on the program and also being with us at the University of Oregon.
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And we've been speaking with the 2006-2007 occupant of the Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics and the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, Rick West. Thank you for being with us.